Welcome to Home Recording Fundamentals, presented by Music Books Plus. My name is Andrew Leyenhorst. I am the assistant editor of Professional Sound and Professional Lighting magazines published by NWC. Today I'll be going over a few considerations for recording at home, including your room, recording equipment, as well as actual recording techniques. Keeping these considerations in mind, you'll find yourself making high-quality recordings in no time. The first consideration to keep in mind is actually the room that you're recording in, and just how reflective it is in terms of how it responds to sound. The reason for this is, for example, if you're recording a vocal track and you have a very live room, there's a very, very high chance you're going to get a lot of those reflections coming back into your microphone. And when you add processing, like compression or anything else for that matter, any such processing that you do to your track will affect not only the actual content of your recording that you want for the song, but whatever extraneous noise is behind it as well. That's not to say that you don't always want to record your room, but in 90% of cases, that's a deliberate decision that you want to make. So, how do we go about mitigating these reflections and creating a conducive space for recording? Obviously, the best way to go about it would be to go the route of bringing an acoustician in, having a look at your room, and putting up acoustic panels, something of that nature, but you can do this yourself in a way. Soft and dense materials in general can act as what is referred to as a passive absorber. Any type of material that just sort of sits in the room and helps deaden sound whether you intend for it to or not. This can include blankets, couch cushions, your cat lounging on the chair he claimed from you, he's deadening sound. Mattresses also make a great one, so if you've got an extra few camper mattresses laying around, throw those up on your wall. Any degree of passive absorption that you can get up onto your walls in your recording space is going to be conducive to getting better recordings. Evenly distribute whatever you have on hand throughout your room and just see what kind of difference it makes. Even if it's a matter of just hanging a blanket on each wall, that's going to help to mitigate reflections in your room. And again, play around to see what you have and experiment with different placements of things. And again, try to be as evenly distributed as you can. But ideally, you do want to pick, say, a corner, if you have one, to kind of set up as a makeshift booth. The reason I say this is so that you have a spot in your room where you know and is dialed up to be the least reflective. Especially if you're recording vocals, acoustic guitar, horns, anything of that nature. You want to be in a spot where there'll be as few reflections as possible coming back into your microphone. To further that point, as the performer, you want to be standing in the corner performing out into the room, rather than performing into the corner. The reason for this is that if you're performing directly into the corner, it's going to activate the rest of the room behind you, and you're going to get more reflections coming back into your mic regardless. Whereas if you turn around and perform into the room with that extra absorption behind you, especially if you're using a microphone with a cardioid pickup pattern, the microphone will reject reflections coming from the far side of the room, while the absorption behind you will prevent them from reflecting back into the active side of your capsule. To reiterate, ideally, you want the most passive absorption that you can get going as you can. Again, blankets, pillows, curtains, cushions. A carpeted room is ideal. Don't use egg cartons. Those are made of paper. They're not doing anything. But ultimately, you want to be mindful of what your room sounds like and be careful that you're not getting unwanted reflections and reverb in your recordings, because ultimately they will be processed with whatever processing you want to put on, and it will come through. The last thing you want in your mix is to compress your vocal and have a bunch of room behind it that shouldn't be there, especially when you wanted to route it to a different reverb anyway. It takes away your freedom to manipulate in that way. Not to mention that too many bad reflections can also lead to phase issues and all sorts of other junk that you just don't want to have to deal with. So make sure that your room is deadened to an extent that is workable. Now, when it comes to recording equipment, obviously the edges of the universe are the limit. There's really nothing that you can't get. But we'll talk about just the main things that you'll need, namely an audio interface, microphones, some kind of monitoring, and peripherals. When you're getting ready to buy gear, you're going to want to keep in mind exactly what you'll actually be using it for, so understand your needs. What are you going to be recording? How many inputs do you need? Do you plan on just doing small sessions, of vocals and some acoustic guitars, that kind of stuff that we mentioned earlier, or do you plan on recording a whole drum set? These are things that you need to consider, because obviously you're going to need to be able to handle the amount of inputs and whatnot required for the sessions that you plan on doing. Luckily, there's an interface for just about everything, whether you need a single input or you need, 4 preamps with expandability up to, say, 20 inputs that you can do via ADAT. For our example today, we'll just assume we're going with a simple setup that only requires 2 inputs. A classic example of an interface here would be the Scarlett 2i2 by Focusrite, or perhaps the ID14 by Audient. In a home setup, the interface is the hub of your studio. It's where all of your audio is going to run in and out, so obviously you want to make sure you make the right choice here. Beyond interfaces, you're also going to need microphones, obviously. I would personally suggest equipping yourself with a couple different options to begin with, namely some kind of large diaphragm condenser, or some variety of dynamic mic, whether small or large diaphragm. I suggest getting a few different mics rather than just a single workhorse, because different mics offer different things and can get you the sound you need before you even get into the box. It is certainly important to keep in mind that your microphone choice will dictate the sound of your recording to an extent. Condenser microphones tend to be more sensitive, given their electricity-based operating principles. Condenser mics have powered capsules compared to dynamic mics, which work based on physical principles having to do with the movement of the capsule as it responds to sound. Condenser microphones tend to be brighter, more sensitive, as I said, and certainly offer a degree of clarity that you won't necessarily find with a dynamic. A condenser mic will also offer that extra bit of detail that you're looking for, compared to a dynamic in most cases. With dynamic mics, however, since they're not quite as sensitive, it means you can push them a little bit harder. They work really, really nicely on high SPL sources, SPL meaning sound pressure level, loud stuff, guitar cabinets, snare drums, anything of that nature. Obviously, you can mess around and see what sounds good with what, but typically you'll find dynamic mics on those types of loud sources, bass cabinets as well. The point that I'm essentially trying to reach is that every microphone is unique, and every microphone is going to offer you something different, so don't be afraid to play around, especially depending on what you're doing. In a vocal context, if you're recording some sort of hi-fi pop or indie, for example, or maybe trap, something that requires your vocals to be very bright, very clear, very, very full, you're probably going to want to reach for a large diaphragm condenser to start out, because it's going to sound closer to what you need in the mix from the moment you start recording it. Whereas something more aggressive, if you're getting into punk or metal, or just want a vocal that's extremely intimate and close up, a dynamic might work for you a little bit better. It's all about giving yourself the options to engineer the right sound that you need. To clarify the varying sensitivities between dynamic and condenser mics, the idea is essentially, again, with condensers having a powered capsule, they produce much, much more output than a dynamic mic does with its non-powered capsule, and therefore, dynamic mics are inherently quieter, which gives you that space to push them harder. If you're just starting to put your mic locker together, some entry-level options could include the Audio-Technica AT2020 or Rode NT1. If you're looking to spend a little bit more, the Aston Origin and Spirit are great options. What you're hearing right now is the Aston Origin. If you're happy to throw some cash around, the Neumann TLM 103 is a fantastic choice. Some popular options for large diaphragm dynamic mics include the Shure SM7B, Electrovoice RE20, and Aston Stealth. When it comes to small diaphragm dynamic mics, luckily the ubiquitous options are fairly inexpensive, those being the Shure SM57 and Sennheiser MD421. The next thing to focus on as far as your gear is monitoring, whether it's headphones, speakers. You're going to need something that can accurately reproduce your audio so you can properly hear what it is you're recording. I would argue that in a context like this, you might actually want to prioritize getting a good pair of studio monitoring headphones, but ideally you want to get studio monitor headphones and speakers. The reason why I say to prioritize headphones is because unless you're building a control room discrete from the live floor, if you're recording, you're going to be wearing your headphones to prevent bleed coming in from your speakers. In this kind of setup, you're going to be using your headphones to both record and mix, so it's important to have a good pair. And of course, any reputable manufacturer of recording gear will have a slew of headphones on offer, whether it's AKG, Sennheiser, Shure, Audio-Technica. They've all got plenty of great options, so take the time to find what's right for you. I personally have used the Sennheiser HD280 Pros for a number of years, so that's my preference, but obviously you may like something different. When it comes to speakers, you're going to want to find something that's appropriate for the size of your room. If you're in a small room with low ceilings or something, a pair of 8-inch drivers might be a little bit overbearing, even with built-in trim features turned on. Granted, if you do prefer more low-end and beefier speakers with bigger drivers, be my guest. Just understand that you may have some trouble contending with your room, and you may be hearing things a little bit more bassy than they even should be because of how your room responds to your speakers. Make sure you're not setting up in a corner. Leave yourself some space from the wall if you can, and keep an eye out for different features on your speakers with room control and whatnot to compensate for that extra low end. The most important thing with speakers is, especially in this context, less about the speakers themselves and more about your understanding of how they sound and how your room reacts to them. The room thing, especially as far as speakers go, is much less apparent than reverb and things like that. Obviously, if you're playing your speakers into a room that's completely untreated, you're still going to get a hell of a lot of reverb, but keep in mind that the actual physical construction of your room does have slight bearing on how reflections of sound bounce around and may cause certain deficiencies in terms of how sounds are represented when you're hearing them from the speakers due to phase cancellation and whatnot. So this is also another reason for your headphones, is again to cross-reference what you're hearing from your speakers with what your sound is like perfectly contained in a non-physical space between your ears. Yamaha's HS series is a fantastic place to start for studio monitors, as they offer a bunch of different sizes and their speakers sound really, really good for what they cost. Rocket KRKs are another solid option as well. Just keep in mind that they tend to be a little bit more boosted in the low mids and low end, as they're geared towards electronic music in most cases. You'll get a more flat frequency response from other manufacturers, but KRKs are very good. There are also software considerations for monitoring, such as NX by Waves, which is a virtual mix room that basically uses your headphones to reproduce impulse responses of real rooms. To take this a step further, Slate Audio offers the VSX system, which includes an actual physical pair of headphones dialed in to have a flat frequency response, as well as their VSX software, which again is a collection of impressive impulse responses that emulate real spaces, from professional studio control rooms to Steven Slate's car, so you can really, really reference your stuff anywhere. You can also employ calibration software such as SonarWorks to digitally calibrate your speakers and headphones to your room. On the topic of software, things can definitely get a little bit murky. As far as DAWs go, or digital audio workstations, your actual recording software, that's pretty much entirely a matter of preference. Most DAWs aren't inherently better or worse than other DAWs. They just offer different feature sets and ultimately all kind of do the same thing in a different way as far as the presentation. If you're doing a lot of arranging or beat making or anything like that, you're probably going to want to go with, say, Logic Pro or Ableton Live. If you're doing a lot of live recording, Pro Tools is, the industry standard, and it'll work for other things too. But again, your DAW it's an intensely personal decision, and you got to pick what you like. Granted, if you've never touched a DAW before, GarageBand actually is a great place to start if you have a Mac, as it is kind of built to be an introductory crash course into Logic Pro down the road. The two softwares are very sensibly designed in that regard to sort of create that progression from one to the next once you get comfortable with GarageBand. But again, as far as DAWs go, I can't tell you absolutely which one you should go with. understand what kind of music you want to make, the nature of the recording that you're going to be doing, and make your choice based on that. Dealing with software beyond that, plugins, for example, are a whole other discussion. All you should know at this point is that there are millions out there. The stock plugins supplied by any DAW will be more than enough for what you need to start learning the fundamentals of processing and mixing, which I will cover in a later seminar. The final major thing when it comes to buying gear and the equipment you're going to need is, again, don't forget your peripherals and to account for those in your budget. Mic stands, mic cables, other cables like, speaker cable, for example, to go from your interface to your monitors. These are all things that you will invariably need and, again, will need to remember to buy them. Nothing's more annoying than getting home, going to record, and realizing that you don't have stands or, that you don't have sufficient cabling. Always make sure to consider these things when you're picking up gear. So once you've got your gear home and set up and ready to go, how do you make the most of your recordings? Pretty much every application is mic placement. We've already discussed the merits of mic choice and how every microphone is unique and has its own sound, really, and how you can use that to tailor the sound of your recordings right at the source. However, placement is also going to play just as much of a factor into this. Of course, different instruments and different sources will have different practices as far as how you should be miking them up, but we'll discuss that now. The main one is probably going to be vocals, and how you mic that up is going to slightly change based on the microphone that you choose. If you're using your condenser mic, which is again more sensitive and just all around more detailed, you can usually give yourself a little bit of distance. For a nice, natural, smooth response, you can stay maybe 6 to 10 inches off of the mic. And generally, I like to align the mic so it's somewhere between a singer's mouth and chest, because I prefer to record a little bit more of the chest resonance than just hot air coming out of their mouth. You like to have a nice resonant and full vocal, and again, where you've got the mic relative to the singer will slightly change these factors. It's important to keep in mind something referred to as the proximity effect, which is basically that the closer a sound source is to the capsule of the microphone, the more low-end response you're going to get. It only makes sense. So if you're really looking to get a really full vocal, a proper full vocal with absolutely no room for anything else, feel free to get up nice and close. You can if you want, but you'll have to compensate for that in the mix. But yeah, simply notice the difference between 6 inches from the mic and right up in it. If you're using a dynamic mic for vocals, chances are you just want to get up nice and close, because the proximity effect is something you're planning on dealing with, and the whole idea of using a dynamic in a lot of cases is to take advantage of how close you can get without driving them too much due to their lower output. Keep in mind that that's a very vague and surface level description of the differences between dynamic and condenser mics and the way that they respond to different sources. But for our purposes, I think it gets the point across. The gist of this is all to say that, especially with vocals, when you're recording, you can't just haphazardly throw the mic up and start singing into it. You want to pay attention and be very deliberate about how it's placed relative to the singer and how the sound changes the closer or further you get, both horizontally and vertically. If you're recording an acoustic source like a guitar or violin or even some forms of, hand percussion, you're going to want to go with your condenser in most cases, just because with those types of instruments, one of the most important things is capturing the sound of the whole instrument rather than just sort of really isolating one part. And especially with acoustic guitars, for example, you probably want to go 8 to 12 inches of distance so that the sound coming from the instrument actually has an opportunity to fully propagate. The proximity effect here is also something to keep in mind to a greater extent than with vocals. Especially, again, with extremely resonant instruments. If you stick the mic too close, it's just going to be boomy and disgusting sounding. And for that reason, I also discourage, say, pointing your microphone directly at the sound hole of an acoustic guitar, but rather somewhere between the sound hole and like the 12th fret, or even around the 12th fret with, a foot of space away to the mic. That's really going to give your mic a nice window to capture the whole instrument rather than just the absolute thundering boominess of the sound hole in the body. But again, you can also try recording two mics at once, have both a condenser and a dynamic in there. Just make sure that they're equidistant from each other and that the capsules are as lined up as they can be to prevent phase issues. If we're talking about electric guitar or bass and we're miking up cabinets, this is another case in which mic placement might even be more important. When you're sticking a microphone on a speaker right on the grill, the smallest movement, millimeters, will completely change your tone. An important thing to understand is that when you're sticking a mic on a cab is that, especially close to the cone, you're going to be dealing with unrelenting brightness in most cases. So make sure to dial up the amp, usually with a lot less presence or treble than you'd think you'd need. Because again, having this stick your ear right in front of a cabinet at some point. Obviously not at an unsafe volume, but if you stick your ear right in front of a guitar cab, you'll notice just how piercingly bright it is. So you want to compensate for that ahead of time, just by the way you're dialing your amp up. But then you can experiment with placement on the cone between, pointing the mic directly at it. Maybe if you want to roll off some high end, you can tilt it slightly off axis. You can also experiment with, pointing the mic directly at the very center of the speaker cone, or you can move it over a tiny bit and point it more around the edges. Any of these changes in positioning will drastically alter your tone as it's recorded. So keep that in mind. And again, play with your mic placement before you start recording real takes. Take the time to find exactly the right microphone or microphone combination. You can use two here as well. The 57 and 421 is deadly and, again, ubiquitous. But also consider phase. Once again, line your capsules up and make sure that they're not varying distances away from the cabinet. If you're recording a source with a lot of low end, again, bass cab, an upright bass, even a kick drum, for example, this is also where your large diaphragm, both condensers and dynamics, shine. Dynamics especially on the super loud stuff, though. Now, I use these specific instruments as examples, but you can sort of use these principles as a guideline for whatever you're recording. Ultimately, it is a subjective art. It involves a lot of experimentation to find exactly the right kind of sound that you want to get. But these are some things that you can keep in mind to give you a reference, a starting point that'll allow you to get more comfortable with recording a little bit quicker, and so that you can find some results faster. The other major part of your signal chain, obviously, is going to be your preamps. You want to make sure you're recording at a healthy level, not too loud, not too quiet. If it's too quiet, it's just when you go to compressor, again, add processing, it's going to amplify your noise floor more than anything else. If it's too loud, obviously, it's just going to get distorted to hell and sound not good. Generally, you want to set pre-fader metering on your DAW's input track. Generally, you want to set input pre-fader metering on the DAW track you're recording to, and record somewhere between -10 and -5 dB. Maybe -3 or -2 if you really like things loud and you want to tickle your preamp and distort it a little bit. Do this tastefully. But generally, yeah, -10 to -5 is a safe range. Keep in mind as well on your interface/preamps, whatever you're using, condenser microphones require 48-volt phantom power, so turn that on if you're using a condenser. But beyond that, it really is a world of experimentation and artistry where the sounds that you craft really depend on what you want, and the way you're going to achieve that is entirely the product of the way that you choose to record things. While we've only just barely delved into the world of recording, I hope you're able to take something useful away from this. And I want to reiterate that, again, These are mostly guidelines and just ideas to get you started and hopefully expedite your process of learning to engineer at home. My name is Andrew Leyenhorst for Music Books Plus. Thank you for listening.